Hi, my name's Thete and I'm going to be discussing today what sort of things we might like to see in 3rd edition Age of Sigmar, which is rumoured to be potentially on its way. But first, welcome to the new studio. It's not quite set up, it's very embryotic, you're not having a proper look around yet because it's absolutely shocking, but hopefully in the next couple of weeks, hasn't even got electricity at the moment, we're relying on natural light here, but in the next couple of weeks it should start to take shape and I should start to be able to use it for much more than just discussion videos, but it's getting there, although not everything has gone according to plan. But first, Age of Sigmar, 3rd edition, and I honestly don't know whether the rumours about 3rd edition are because in reality it is coming and it just hasn't been officially announced, or whether it's because we just know that Games Workshop with their major games bring out new editions every few years because, you know, that's how they make money, and it's been a few years since 2nd edition. But either way, it will be coming at some point and there are things that we might like to discuss. Now, I have to say, just from my background, so I played Warhammer Fantasy Battle back in the day with a little bit of 40k, but mostly Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and then I stopped for like a decade, and I mean a decade, World of Warcraft and all that, and then I returned, and you know, I looked at Age of Sigmar probably in the same way that Warhammer Fantasy Battle players at the time looked at it and went, but we'll see. I mean, I had confidence in Games Workshop that they produce, you know, well thought out games, gave it a try. And actually, it does, you know, it grows on you. It has certain advantages. There are things that are not ideal. Now, what I want to go through is some of the things that I think would improve the game, as well as to pick on a couple of things that I see discussed here and there that I think are either the wrong call or nothing to do with the rules, and you shouldn't be messing about the rules for it. So there's a couple of things where I think you can go down a dead end with trying to improve Age of Sigmar. One of them is when you get people who sort of think, oh, you know, this needs improving because I keep encountering this situation, and what they're talking about in a situation are, you know, coming across one army against another doesn't seem to work. There is a certain element of paper, rock, scissors about it, and there is a certain element of certain players not being able to be good judges of armies and how well they perform because some players are not as good, or some players just don't have access to the range of models. For example, when I started playing 40k again, when 9th edition came out, and I just lost my first few games, and I decided that, okay, you know, I was coming back to the game, and there's things about the game I'm not good enough with. But I did also come to the conclusion that the list I'd done was not good. But those were the models I had. Now, you know, it takes time to get yourself new models, and for some people, a lot of time because it's not a cheap thing. So sometimes your list just isn't good, and it's not a quick thing to change. So I want to focus on things that would be improvements in the game, not based on, oh, whenever I bring this army against this army, I always win or lose or whatever. And I think objectives is a big one for me. As I say, I've had a 10-year gap, or I did have a 10-year gap between about 2007 and 2017 of playing any Warhammer games. And I was surprised at how much 40k had come on. I didn't think 40k was that brilliant a game back in the day. That's why I didn't play it that much. There's a couple of other reasons as well. And but now I think it's amazing. And I'll tell you what I think is the key strength of it, the absolute key strength, and that is how you acquire victory points. Victory points are gained in 40k now. You have your primary objectives, which are based around the battle plan, as you might call it, the scenario, and then you have secondary objectives which you choose yourself from a list. That is brilliant because it means you only need a set number of scenarios, and you make every game different because you will choose different secondaries based on the particular army you have, the particular list within the army you have, and the list you're facing and the scenario you have. There are so many things in there that combine to make so many different combinations of approaching the game. Age of Sigmar, on the other hand, doesn't. Everything to do with the victory points is determined by the scenario or the battle plan, which means that Games Workshop kept having to create more and more different types of battle plan to inject that, you know, variety in there, but it's fake because you can condense down the battle plans to 4 or 5 different types when it comes down to it, and the only difference after that is increasingly bizarre deployment areas. That's all it is, increasingly fiddly deployment areas. And I am against anything that means it takes you longer to get into the game. And setting out your battlefield can take a long time with some of these battle plans. So that's a major failing, and I would like to see the 40k method. Now, here's the problem with that. I also recognise that although there are certain mechanics in common between 40k and Age of Sigmar, or indeed Fantasy Battle, the games need to feel fundamentally different. Now, to me, they will always be different because it's sci-fi and fantasy, and I see the games through those lenses. But for other people, you don't just want the same game system, and one for fantasy, one in a fantasy world and one in a sci-fi world. They have to be fundamentally different games. And I worry that if you just mapped the objectives rules, mechanics from 40k onto Fantasy Battle, or Age of Sigmar rather in this case, which I think would work perfectly. In isolation, I think it would be an absolutely stonking upgrade. The worry is, does it then feel too much like 40k? So that's my only thing there. Now, Games Workshop did tentatively experiment with secondaries in last year's General's Handbook, but it was very poor. It was like, okay, you can choose some secondaries here. Oh, great, I was really excited when I saw them. And it's like, but they don't count for anything. What? If you get a tie, then they count. Other than that, they don't count. It's like, well, that's ridiculous. Then they don't count. You're not going to play the game for your secondaries. You play the game for the main objectives, because it's almost never a tie. And if it is, and you were putting a lot of focus into it, the only effort you'll put with the secondaries there is just choosing the ones that will naturally, organically occur. You won't put any effort in the game to doing it because you'll be sacrificing your primaries. And if you're in a position to focus on primaries and secondaries, you're winning anyway. So that was poor, but it might have been an indication that Games Workshop are aware that there's something wrong there. So that's encouraging, but that's what I would absolutely, if try and mimic what they've done in 40k, try and come up with a different system, but if you can't, do you know what? I would just lift it and use that. The other one I would maybe have a little think about is summoning. Now, there's a few issues with summoning, but I think my main issue with summoning is, so, for example, when I went to my one and only tournament for Age of Sigmar so far, because, the pandemic got in the way, I took a Nurgle list. And of course, because you can summon, I took some extra plague bearers, I took some plague drones, which I've never really put in a list. And I took some Nurglings and things like that. I knew I'd mostly be using the plague bearers, but other things as well. But there's a huge list of things you could summon that won't be in my list. I mean, some things like a Great Unclean one, I took a Great Unclean one on my list. I thought, well, if it dies, I can just bring that back, summon that back. It won't be the same one, but I've got the model for it. The problem is that if you think strategically in a game, oh, I'd like to bring in whatever at this point, Poxwalker or something, and then it's like, oh, but I don't have the model. That's the problem. To gain maximum strategic advantage out of summoning, you need to have the models for your army list, and then all the models you might conceivably want to summon. Now, yes, some you could argue you would never, there's no scenario where you would summon, Unit A over Unit B. But there are situations, and maybe a niche situation comes up and you don't have the models for it. So I think it's a little bit weak. Also, you have this perception, I keep seeing comments about, oh, it's not very fair having 3,000 points against 2,000 points. It's like Games Workshop insists that they take into account summoning when they're deciding the points values. Now, some people may disagree on that. I don't think they're lying. You may disagree whether they're getting it tuned correctly or not, but that is an issue there. I think a better way of summoning is actually the Legions of Nagash, where you're not really summoning a new unit, you're bringing back one that's been finished off. So there you've got a trade-off. You have to pay your command point. It's not just points that you're organically acquiring over the game. You don't, you've got constraints in terms of where you can summon them. I mean, you do with summoning things as well, but that's in relation to a hero. This is in relation to a hero and a fixed point on the battlefield that you chose from the start, which allows your opponents to frustrate you. So there's a bit of strategic thinking there. Whereas, the chaos summoning, no. I think that needs reworking or removing. It's not actually needed in the game. You could remove it, rebalance the points, and that would be fine. The next one, now this is, I think, a big one, which is the Lookout Sir rule. Now, I have seen comments about, oh, just change it to be very similar to the 40k one. That would work, that would work. Let me identify what I think is the problem and then what are some potential solutions. The problem in Age of Sigmar, and this was the thing that took me the longest to get around my head when I came back, you know, having played Fantasy Battle 10 years before. There's no line of sight issues in Age of Sigmar. Now that simplifies the game. I mean, the whole point of Age of Sigmar was, I gather, to simplify mechanics. Absolutely simplifies it if you don't have to do this silly thing where you end up getting a spool of cotton to see if you've got line of sight or not. Get that, absolutely fine. The problem is that your characters have no respite. And you know, I get that they shouldn't be completely invisible, but at the same time, you know, if they're protecting themselves at the back, they're protecting themselves at the back. You shouldn't be able to fire everything at them as long as you've got the range. And you know, you can have your character behind 3 friendly units and behind a hill, but a finger's pointing out from that, you know, sticking out from that hill, and you can be shot at through those through that whole fog of war, quite frankly. That doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. And from a, you know, a strategic point of view as well, in terms of thinking of the mechanics of the game, it doesn't make sense either. Couple of solutions. So one, you could do what they do in 40k and just say, look, if it's within 3 inches of a friendly unit of similar size, obviously you don't hide a great unclean one behind plague bearers, but if it was say a poxwalker, say, you know, if it's within 3 inches of a friendly unit and it's not the closest target, then you can't target it. That is better than just -1 to hit. That is inevitably better. But that's not the only thing you could do. You could introduce line of sight rules. You could say that regardless of the model dimensions, if the base is behind, it doesn't stick out from friendly units of at least 3 models or whatever, then it also can't be targeted. So you could do that as well. So you can either approach it from the line of sight point of view, and I admit, you know, there you could get into marginal situations, or you could do the 40k thing, which is mechanically easier to implement, doesn't have arguments or anything like that. And I'd still be in favour of the line of sight thing, mostly because, as I said with the objectives, just lifting out rules from 40k. You don't want to do that too much. I would do it for the objectives because I think that's worth it. Whereas if there's another solution, I'd probably tend to go that rather than try and make it look, you know, too much convergence with 40k. Another thing I would maybe look at is layers of complexity. Now, it's both a strength and a weakness, I think. So Age of Sigmar is really good for introducing people to a game because you can just have the basic Age of Sigmar game. And then what you can do is you add layers onto it. So things like Realms of Battle you can add on, and endless spells, and, you know, and summoning. But I think some of them are unnecessary. And the one I think that they could just get rid of would be scenery rules. Now, the army-specific scenery rules are okay, and there can be issues with some of the larger ones that we're getting. That's not even the biggest one now. But generally speaking, yeah, the army-specific scenery rules, they're fine. But having rolling dice for each individual bit of scenery on your board and then having to remember what the symbols mean and all the rest of it, I think that's unnecessary. And again, it comes back to, think about what you have to do to play the game. You know, you've got to set up your table, you've got to roll for your battle plan, you've got to put your objectives down, mark out your deployment zones, go through your list with your opponent. You know, all of this stuff is stuff you're doing before you even play the game. And one thing I have a big issue with, Age of Sigmar, just like 40k, they're designed around 2,000 point games. Yes, they put things in to allow you to play smaller, of course, but they're never as satisfactory. The game is clearly designed around 2,000 points. And in gaming, like my gaming club, for example, this will be very common. You don't really get time to have 2,000 point games because it takes a certain amount of time to play such a game. And then if you've got lots of admin at the start, setting out and packing up, because most people play in a gaming club, they don't play in their own home because most people don't have the facilities. I'm now getting the facilities, but most people don't. So anything that you have to do before you even start the game that is admin, and you have to ask yourself, is it worth it? Realms of Battle thing, yeah, I can think that's worth it. Going through your list with your opponent, didn't used to in Fantasy Battle, it was secret. You know, when you had a magic weapon, you announced it when you used it, not before. But that's useful. Having special rules, you know, is having a hill be scary or inspiring a useful addition to the game? Is it fun? No. That sort of thing I think would be better as a White Dwarf supplement on suggested house rules to spice things up, not a core part of the game. So I would remove that. The other thing is, you know, I mentioned endless spells there. I'd maybe have a look at that. I think one issue that some people have, and it's not a major issue, but it is an issue, and I think it's fair enough, is predatory endless spells. So you pay your points for an endless spell. You also have to cast it. There are constraints already there. The idea that you put down a predatory endless spell, and maybe you get some use out of it, but then in the very next turn your opponent can just take charge of it and send it back your way, that's a bit of a bite on the bum. I don't think that's, you know, when you're paying the points for it and they're not cheap, you know, and I think, and I mean, that's really why I don't use them. The only time I would use a predatory endless spell is if it's one that at least can't adversely affect your army, which some are like that. But even then, it's still a bit of a cheek that someone can take it back. When they have the option to dispel it, and they have the option to dispel it in any turn as well before you even get to use it on the second round. So I would think twice about having predatory endless spells be capturable effectively by your opponent. And then the last one, and I think it's the standard one, and some people may be surprised I've not mentioned it already. I've mentioned it at the end because it also may get people to roll their eyes, but the double turn needs to be gone. And I'm sure people will have seen the arguments for this. I'll set them out as simply and as quickly as I can. What happens in a game of Age of Sigmar is the person who finishes deploying first decides who goes first or second. Now, I would keep that. I've also seen people saying we should just roll to see what's the first turn after deployment, like in 40k. It works in 40k. I wouldn't have it any other way in 40k. Age of Sigmar, it doesn't work, and the reason it doesn't work is because of battalions. The use of battalions, if you don't, it allows you to reduce the number of drops you have so that you've got that flexibility to go, right, I can deploy before they can, no matter who wins the roll-off, so I'm going to do that so I can choose who goes first or second. I'm fine with that. And I don't really use battalions that much, but I'm fine with that rule. I think it's good, and I think it's a good divergence from 40k. Again, a rule that makes the two systems fundamentally different gaming systems, as long as it works mechanically, not for the sake of it, I think is great. And so battalions works. Other than, I mean, if you were to roll for who got the first turn after deployment, your battalion is just an expensive way of getting an extra relic and a command point. No. So that's, I'm fine with whoever finishes deploying first gets to choose. That's a good feature. Because there's some control over that, and as you deploy, you'll know that's going to be the case as well. You've set out your armies, you know how many drops you've got, you know how many drops your opponent's got. You can be thinking strategically as you deploy, you will know who's going to have the choice. And you can work out what that choice is likely to be as well. So there's strategy in there. The double turn removes strategic thinking. That's why I'm against it. Because if you go first, whether you wanted to go first or your opponent chose you to go first, which is the more important thing here, your opponent is setting themselves up for the double turn. And yes, they've got a slightly less than 50% chance of getting it, but you can have a situation. In fact, I judge harshly anyone who gets a double turn for Battle Round 2. You know, if they go second in Battle Round 1 and first in Battle Round 2, I judge harshly anyone who cannot basically win the game with that. They would have to roll appallingly badly in a way that just hardly ever happens. So, and that's the thing. I mean, a double turn later in the game arguably is not as big a deal, but it is still. And it's just that, it removes strategic thinking, because the way you would approach a turn differs very, you know, if you're thinking to yourself, right, then they're going to have a turn, then I have another turn. And you'd treat it in a particular way. But if you thought to yourself, but they could get 2 turns, then you'd treat it in a very different way. And it also encourages people to be more cagey, which is also less fun. The idea of potentially your opponent having 2 turns makes you behave more cagily. That is inherently less enjoyable as a game. So the double turn, and people will say things like, but it's a bit of fun, this randomness in there. Okay, fun randomness, do you know where that goes? That goes in open systems. It doesn't go in matched play. The purpose of matched play is just what it says. It's to allow for strategic thinking. It's to allow for skill levels to be tested. Yes, it's still a dice game, but you roll so many dice. As long as you're not basing your strategy on the roll of a few dice, which is effectively what you're doing with a double turn, then the odds even out anyway. So those are my thoughts about what would improve Age of Sigmar, as well as the ones maybe we should steer clear of. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And until next time, I'll see you later.